Forensic nursing is a fairly new and unique specialty that incorporates nursing, forensic science, and the justice system. Forensic nurses have a significant role outside of the hospital or medical setting. They advocate for healthcare policy changes and strive to help those affected by violent crime. They work closely with law enforcement and the legal system. Forensic nurses have a significant role in the criminal justice system, providing clinical expertise, education, and teaching about the medical legal evaluation of patients affected by violent crime. In the 1970s, there were a few ER nurses that started to notice the need for specialized care for patients they saw in the emergency room that presented after being sexually assaulted. The first sexual assault nurse examiners, or SANE nurses, came from three different states: Texas, Tennessee, and Minnesota. These small programs recognize SANEs as nurses or nurse practitioners who received specialized training to care for patients who had experienced sexual assault and were trained to collect evidence and testify in court. And then in 1992, a small group of mostly SANE nurses from the US and Canada came together to form the IAFN, or the International Association of Forensic Nurses. And the goal was to create a nursing organization that specialized in caring for and treating victims and perpetrators of violent crime. What began as a small group of 72 nurses has now grown to over 6,000 members as of December of 2022, and there are 30 chapters of the IAFN around the world. It was not until 1995 that the ANA, or American Nurses Association, recognized that forensic nursing is a formal nursing specialty. There are many different specialties within forensic nursing, including SANE nurses, sexual assault nurse examiners, FNEs, forensic nurse examiners, death investigators, nurse coroners, corrections nurses, legal nurse consultants, nurse attorneys, and there are also nurses that specialize in human trafficking, elder abuse, child abuse, and forensic psychiatric nurses. Forensic nursing is a quickly growing field to meet the public health needs. The goal of this podcast is to introduce you to some of the different roles within forensic nursing. This episode today will be one of several episodes highlighting different specialties within forensic nursing. Good morning. I have Sheila Early here with me today. She is the co-founder and current president of the Canadian Forensic Nursing Association and former International Association of Forensic Nurses, IAFN, president. She has been called British Columbia's godmother of forensic nursing and has quite a vast background in forensic nursing over the past 30 years or so.
So can you just kind of explain more about your background and kind of how you got into forensic nursing?
Well, it's been 30 years and I've been a nurse for an awfully long time. And my background was initially obstetrics for a short period of time when I found that it wasn't the type of nursing that I really wanted to continue with for a variety of reasons. I love babies and I love new moms. But I wanted the variety of different patient populations. And so a former instructor of mine said, why don't you come to work for me in the emergency outpatient department? And I was like, okay. And I'll give it a try. And I guess the try worked out because I was there for like 25 years in emergency nursing. But of course, during my different progression of roles, staff nurse, more in charge nurse, eventually to administration with a clinical background. And I had discovered that what I really wanted to do was teach clinical nursing to nurses in the acute care setting. And eventually most of that was in Saskatchewan, but when I moved to British Columbia, I was able to create a role which was the forerunner of the nurse clinician. That was back in 1991, so long time ago. And it was a role that was created because the emergency nurses didn't have a dedicated person to provide not only clinical expertise in unusual cases or serious cases, but also to keep them updated on the education, because by that time emergency nursing was changing very frequently. New things coming in, new drugs, and my hospital administration agreed with me that let's create this role. So they pretty much gave me a carte blanche for a year,
Wow.
and that became the forerunner of what we know as nurse clinicians, clinical educators, because often one person would share 3 or 4 portfolios before that, and I was dedicated only to emergency. In the course of that work, of course, violence and trauma is part of the everyday emergency nurse's role. The trauma comes in many forms, but much of it comes in interpersonal or intimate partner violence. And the intimate partner violence was treated superficially, and that's no comment on healthcare. That's the way we were all educated. Fix the bruise, send them on their way to a social worker. As far as the interpersonal violence, they probably actually got more attention because, because sometimes police were involved. If it was an altercation, if it was a car crash, then there were individuals who were, either the person who caused the crash, or they were the ones who suffered the consequences. And so it became important to know, okay, so who's the driver of these 8 people? And how do we know? Because everyone has the ability to deceive if they so wish. I don't use the word lie, but I say deceive because they either don't disclose or they disclose incorrect information, and we buy into it. About that time, this is early 1992, and we had a sexual assault patient, female, present to our emergency department. And she was accompanied by a Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which is our police force here in Canada in the majority, and in the night shift. Now, anyone who's worked in emergency departments in the 90s and the 2000s know that one doc, one emergency physician on shift, usually from 11 p.m. till 7 a.m. So she presented on off hours. At that time, I am the emergency clinician, which includes following up on complaints. Oh, how much fun. About a day later, my manager called me and she said, we got a complaint from the RCMP about this case a couple nights ago. And she said, can you follow up on this? And I said, oh, sure, And when I looked into it, the officer had articulated very well his concerns. We waited in the waiting room. Everybody saw her. She was crying. We waited X number of hours. I believe it was somewhere between 4 and 6. And he said, and then it came change of shift and we had to wait again, because one doc went home, another one was getting oriented to what was in the department. He said, surely we can kind of do better. That was the gist of his complaint. And, I have to say that at the moment that I read the letter, I thought, so this is the norm. Yeah. I'm sorry to say this is the norm. I've been working in emergency since 1970. It's not any different. My first case in 1970, I knew nothing. I didn't even really understand what was then called rape had to do with healthcare. Neither did the doctor that I assisted. We followed the guidance of a police officer who told us pretty much what to do. That's 1970. And my thought in 1992 was, nothing's changed. Wow. Because it kind of brought me back to, that. And so I started as an educator and, clinical person. I go to my library. Remember, no internet.
Oh, yes.
You need permission to phone outside your local area. You cannot just go and dial somebody in the United States or wherever. You need permission. In fact, I don't think we actually even had computers at that time.
Yeah.
As a hospital piece of equipment. So I went to the library, and the librarian and I, she searched through the files, and she came up with a bunch of things, and she said, here's a whole bunch of articles I got for you. So I started to read them. And I have to say, my heart sank. Because what I discovered is that there were nurses in the United States in 3 different locations:
Mhm.
Memphis, Tennessee,
Mhm.
Amarillo, Texas, and Minneapolis, Minnesota,
Mhm.
that had nurses doing examinations for people who presented post sexual assault since the early 70s.
Mhm. Yeah.
I wasn't alone. Nobody in America knew about them. They were just little dots, you know?
Yeah.
And I have to say, I was extremely intrigued. This was pushing the envelope as far as nursing, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Autonomous
Yeah.
work, responsible to only yourself and your ethics and your education and your knowledge. Well, I was hooked. I thought, wow, this is just like I did my capstone project
Uh-huh.
in my 5th year of nursing.
Uh-huh.
A clinical nurse specialist. Yes, that's what it is. In a bit of a muted form.
Mhm.
So I started searching out where I could get help, and luckily for me, Vancouver had what was called a sexual assault service, and it was physician based. They had actually been doing examinations on women since the late 80s,
Oh.
and it was a roster of female physicians. But there was a nurse clinician, well, she was a nurse educator. She wasn't called a clinician at the time. Um, there, sorted to coordinate things, etc. So I got hold of her, and I went down and talked to her. And serendipity is a word where things happen and you're not really sure why they happen. 2 of that particular staff service had been into California to undergo
Oh.
what was called a nurse examiner. It was called an examiner, sorry, because they weren't looking at nurses, they were looking at physicians.
Mm.
I said, well, can we get hold of that? And she said, yes, I do. I can get it. I have it. And so I wrote to Linda Ledre, who was the coordinator of the Minneapolis, Minnesota program.
Oh. Mhm.
I thought she's the closest one to me. I'm going
Mhm.
to write to her. I did. And she got back to me. And she told me about a conference that was a group that was just starting called the International Association of Forensic Nurses.
Mhm.
Unfortunately, there was no way I could become involved at that point because you couldn't travel. I mean, we
Mhm.
didn't have coffee allowances. Anyway, so I got material from as many sources as I could from the articles. And her name is Carolyn Dudley. Her and I sat down and we created a curriculum for forensic nurse examiners. Except we weren't called forensic nurse examiners.
Mhm.
We were called sexual assault nurse examiner training. Now, I have a problem with the word training because, as I tell my students, I can train monkeys to do some of this work.
Mhm.
But what I educate people to care for individuals in a selected population with knowledge, skill, empathy, and ethics, which, with all due respect to a monkey, that doesn't happen. Um, so, what do I do now? So, I took the whole proposal to my manager, and I said, we need to do this. And I gave her the data behind it, which I won't, you don't need to share. But basically, our patients who presented with sexual assault were not coming to our hospital. They were going an hour and a half into Vancouver for care.
Oh. Mhm.
So when we only saw 10 people, that was like minimist amount
Mhm.
of actual cases that were happening in our jurisdiction.
Mhm.
So she said, what do we need? I said, money. So she, as the manager, she looked for the money. Um, I have to say that it was not easy.
Yeah.
We were pretty much unable to attain funding from the usual sources that healthcare could provide.
Mhm.
In other words, uh, ministries of health, women's equality, um, our own hospital, because at that time hospitals were standalone,
Mhm.
and um, we actually just progressed slowly, slowly, slowly. And we found out that there was a program in Winnipeg, Manitoba that was also starting. So I started to communicate
Wow.
with that individual and share funding ideas. And I have to say that we were actually allowed to phone each other back then. That was, and in June of 1993, so we're talking about 8 to 9 months after this whole idea came to
Mhm.
fruition, we held a town meeting where we invited every individual we could think of who might be affected by this particular project. And for example, law enforcement,
Mhm.
criminal justice, family doctors, because we were taking away a role from them. They worked in the emergency department and they would not be doing
Mhm.
examinations
Mhm.
if we were able to do them. Um, our administrators, social workers who were worked in the community to speak for follow up, our own social workers, because we were just on the verge of getting social workers in the emergency department. And of course, our medical director, I can't leave him out because he'd actually come from Winnipeg and he'd been the connection to tell me about Winnipeg
Oh,
trying to get a program.
wow.
And actually, I just talked about this to the retired nurse manager because we had a 30th anniversary celebration for the particular program I co-founded. And I said, I remember walking out of that meeting, looking at you and thinking, he's just left and said, okay, we'll do it. And it's up to us to do the rest. And she said, yeah. Well, we had grabbed the attention of the hospital foundation
Mm.
and they decided to fund us for a pilot project of 1 year. And so, November of 1993, and I know that the timelines are important for people that are looking at developing programs because that's happening today. This is not all done. In fact, I got an email from an IFN member about a week ago wanting to know how to set up a program.
Wow.
So this is still June 2019. Sorry, I get my dates mixed up because it's been so long. 2000 and sorry, when 1993 we hold a town meeting in June. We don't actually get to do an education course till November of 93,
Mhm.
but we able to open our doors in January 30th of 1994.
Wow.
So it was about an altogether probably an 18-month project from beginning to end.
Wow.
So it's not quick. And then comes the crunch point. You have this program, you don't know how it's going to be accepted. You don't know if it's going to fail, if it's going to come back and um, cause issues within the whole sphere of healthcare,
Right.
because you're really introducing a concept that nobody except 10 nurses, a nurse manager, and an emergency medical director know about.
Mhm. Wow.
Live, nobody knew.
Right.
So to that end, personally, I decided that I would be the nurse on call until we actually got a case. And I was on call with my buddy. We buddied for the first 6 or 8 months because quite frankly, we were afraid to do it alone.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And so my partner and I were called in early February of 1994, and I did the first examination as a nurse examiner
Mhm.
in British Columbia. And the protocols worked out. Um, it was a reported case. We did report it. The patient chose to report, and law enforcement was involved. And just an aside, um, her parents were both physicians,
Oh,
and they allowed me, a nurse, to care for their daughter
wow. Yeah.
once we explained what the whole process was.
Mhm.
Ironically, there was not a court case. Why? Because the perpetrator turned himself into police and he didn't go to trial. He was just sentenced.
Mhm.
So I did not have to appear, and neither did my patient.
Mhm.
And why he turned himself into police 10 days later, I don't know. But in hindsight, there was one piece of evidence that tied him to her, and I had collected it.
Wow.
And it's so insignificant that I tell nurses that's how important not to look over anything. It was a long blonde hair weaved into her dark pubic hair.
Mhm.
And when I saw his picture in the newspaper, he had long blonde hair.
Wow.
Well, we were pretty proud of ourselves. And my coworker Jane, this might work, So that was the beginning. The trials and tribulations over the next, I was actually a nurse examiner from 94 until 2017 or 7 rather. But in 2000, I became coordinator of the program because we got so large.
Mhm.
I left that role in 2006 because I had to provide some way of educating these nurses beyond what was available because there wasn't anything available. There was only one course. And so I moved to an educational facility where I was able to build a 2-year post graduate degree. So once you became an RN, you could take this course, this 2-year course, to become able to work in forensic nursing.
Wow.
And eventually in 2018, a coworker and I also then developed a graduate certificate, which was basically half a degree. So unfortunately, that has now morphed into micro-credentialing
Mhm.
probably because of COVID. How can you hold classes if nobody can come?
Right.
And of course, the move we have had to online education.
Mhm.
So now there is, at that same institution, is a large number, I think it's up to 7 or 8, micro-credentialing courses, and the more you take, the more credits you get and work towards, your goal.
Wow.
So to me, that's even more of a legacy than
Yeah.
the forensic nursing programs because there's only there's only 3 institutions in Canada, educational ones, that actually offer courses for nurses in
Mhm.
forensic education, and one is brand new.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
so, my home institution that I'm still kind of, I really appreciate them. They're just, even though I'm retired from them, they still keep me in the loop. That's the legacy for providing the stepping stones to education in forensic nursing in Canada.
Yeah. Wow.
And yeah, so just to summarize, 1994, 2 programs in all of Canada, and we're at 38 million people right now, I think, somewhere in
Wow.
there. 2 programs, Surrey, British Columbia, and Winnipeg, Manitoba. Now there's over 100.
Wow.
The majority of the programs are in a provincial network in Ontario.
Okay.
There's 37 programs there. Uh, there are provincial network programs, meaning that they have funding. They are usually through the Ministry of Health
Mhm.
um, first in Ontario, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia.
Mhm.
That's 3. However, there are 3 more that are just on the verge. So at some point in time, the provinces will most likely have provincial networks,
Mhm.
which will be, a central body for the care of those who have undergone violence and trauma. The territories are a little far behind, and that's understandable because their patient population and resources.
Mhm.
I have done education in Whitehorse, Yukon, and there is still the beginnings of a more consolidated response there.
Mhm.
Now, when I look overall, I think the change in healthcare, and I always call forensic nursing the game changer in healthcare here in Canada, because what it has done is it has made healthcare seriously look at their responsibility in violence and trauma, because violence and trauma is a public health care issue.
Yeah.
World Health told us this decades ago. The World Health Report of 2000 told us this, and here we are 21 years later and still convincing
Mhm.
countries
Yeah.
that healthcare has a role in violence and trauma.
Mhm. Yeah.
And the reality is, there's so much money to be saved in healthcare, and we
Mhm.
by addressing it, and we could use that money elsewhere.
Right, right. Absolutely. Wow.
So Natalie, that's kind of a summary of the last 30 years.
Wow, that's quite an undertaking. Oh my gosh. Wow. That is impressive. And I know there's so few, I mean, there's a handful of universities that are doing some forensic nursing programs in the US, but not, not a lot. Yeah.
Yep.
Hmm.
No, I could probably name them probably on one hand, maybe part of my second hand.
Yes.
They're all well known to me. The problem with Canadians is we have to pay in Canadian American dollars.
Oh.
So if you register for, Fitchburg University,
Uh-huh.
you, if you're Canadian, you still pay in American dollars. And, and actually Aspen Online is another one.
Uh-huh.
Uh, you know, um, so that, there's also Pittsburgh, Duquesne
Right.
University. So, I'm well aware of all the spots because nurses keep asking me, well, if I can't get it in Canada, where do I go? I say, well, you got a lot of money, you know, you know, and I know several nurses personally that have um, obtained forensic nursing degrees in the United States.
Mhm.
And, it's very costly and
Yeah.
it means you have to get a job real quick to start paying those student loans.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Wow. That's another huge challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
And so we're encouraging Canadian institutions to, of course, build something. But again, it's based on how many students can we get.
Right. Right.
And I have to say that one of the positive effects of COVID is online education.
Hmm.
And I happen to know the educator at my previous facility, and she often will have 26 students from all across Canada taking the same course.
Hmm.
So there's also this cross pollination of knowledge, because
Yeah.
what forensic nursing period in one province is not the same as in another, same as in the United States. I mean, 50 states, you've got 50 state boards, scope of practice is different,
Hmm.
so they share, and always think that sharing and collaboration are the way to a better solution to
Right.
whatever is in front of you.
Sure. Sure. Do you see a lot of differences between practice in Canadian and American forensic nursing?
On the basic practice, no.
Hmm.
We still greet our patients the same way.
Hmm.
We still do physical and medical forensic exam pretty much the same way. We still do the interventions the same way. We still do the same kind of drugs for different things. We all treat sexually transmitted infections. We all look at HIV. We all look at emergency contraception. We do referrals to mental health, social worker resources in the community. The difference lies in two areas. One is the healthcare system,
Hmm.
because, of course, in Canada, the majority of healthcare is free
Right.
for anyone who
Hmm.
qualifies as a resident of Canada. So that means uh, as long as you have landed immigrant status, as long as you have um, citizenship status or are born Canadian, it's free. Now, if you come out of the country and you don't have those things, then you will pay fees. But if you move from one province to another, the your benefits just transfer with you.
Okay.
So after you say I leave one province and I go to another province, my previous province will cover me for 3 months, and my province that I'm now living in picks me up in 3 months. So there's
Mm.
no cost. Um,
Okay.
so that's at plus two. The healthcare mandates are different. For example, it wasn't until the mid 2000s that healthcare was mandated to report gunshot wounds and stab wounds
Mm.
due to our
Okay.
freedom of information and privacy. That's a
Sure.
big thing. So the actually working situation is different because of those external factors. The work
Mhm.
itself is pretty consistent.
Mhm.
Same. Um, we don't have HIPAA,
Oh,
so
okay.
we are not bound by the rules of HIPAA.
Uh-huh.
So that we also have a different criminal justice system.
Right.
And next to healthcare, that's the biggest one. Because what we have in Canada for all provinces and territories is the Criminal Code of Canada. So if I commit a crime in Vancouver,
Mhm.
I am covered by the points of the criminal code regarding that particular event. So let's just say perpetrator in a sexual assault case. It's code section 271. Okay, so it tells what constitutes the crime, what will happen to me once I'm um, charged, and it
Mhm.
also defines the punishment. Now, there's a lot of leeway in the punishment, and
Mhm.
it's in levels. So, not simplifying, but a sexual assault without injury, the punishment is one thing. A
Okay.
sexual assault with significant injuries is another.
Mhm.
Sexual assault with serious injuries, maiming or injuring, well, there's a different one. It's tiered. So basically say sexual assault 1, 2, 3. Now, if
Mhm.
there's a death involved, of course, it moves into another one. And if I do that same crime in Newfoundland,
Mhm.
I'm judged on that same criteria. If I do it in Nunavut, I'm judged on the same criteria. So there's standardization of criminal justice.
Huh.
And
Interesting.
age of consent is 16 anywhere in Canada
Okay.
for sexual activity. There's other guidelines,
Mhm.
consenting, etc. But so
Mhm.
a perpetrator can say, "Oh, gee, I'm from Missouri. I didn't know that Tennessee
Oh,
had a different age of consent,"
right. Mhm.
which I know
Interesting.
happens.
Yes. Yes, it does.
So in Canada, it's like, no.
Mhm.
And we also have, crown prosecutors which is our term for prosecutors. We actually call them crown
Okay.
counsels. And now they're actually called king councils because we're a Commonwealth country.
Oh,
And when Queen Elizabeth died and Prince Charles became King Charles, so now instead of being known as Crown Council QC, Queen Elizabeth, and
uh-huh.
they are now known Crown Council KC, King Charles.
Oh, okay. Oh, interesting.
I mean, it's kind of funny because everybody who you used to send off to, so and so QC, oh, gee, now they got KC, and yet we had to kind of change our, oh, yeah, we're a Commonwealth country. Okay. So those are the two main differences.
Mhm.
The other one, which is nothing to do with our countries, it's funding.
Oh, okay. Mhm.
Our funding for forensic nursing in practice and in education is not solidified in any body yet. For
Oh.
example, forensic nursing is not a specialty in Canada.
Oh.
So what that means is we are not tied to education that, for example, a nurse wanting to become an emergency nurse can access.
Right.
So that's my personal long-term goal and the long-term goal of the Canadian Forensic Nurses Association.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
act like a specialty. Everybody considers us a specialty, but in
Right.
reality, we're not. And that's because we're not recognized by the Canadian
Mhm.
Nurses Association. And 1995 was when these same nurses working in USA were recognized
Mhm.
by your American Nurses Association.
Yeah.
So the logistics of it are much trickier here in Canada,
Mhm.
and we have to meet certain criteria. And
Mhm.
right now, it looks like we've met them on paper. So we're ongoing negotiations with our Canadian Nurses Association body.
Mhm.
That's pretty much the goal for our our association. So that kind of
Yeah.
summarizes. If the other thing that's really throwing a big wrench in this, if you want, is as a Canadian nurse when I wrote for my RN registration, I wrote a US-based exam. So I
Mm-hmm.
still, to this date, and I don't mind saying this to people on your podcast, at 76 years old, if I so choose, I could work in almost every single state in the United States of America,
Mm-hmm.
which means I could be part of the nursing specialty. I could I could probably run a program. I could teach anywhere I wanted to. Um,
Uh-huh.
but I still teach, but I do guest things rather than
Uh-huh.
in the United States and internationally. So it's kind of ironic that my skills would be fully recognized in the United States, and yet here in Canada, they're not.
Right. Wow. Hmm. Interesting.
It is.
Yeah, that's hard to, yeah. It's kind of hard for me to wrap my head around that, you know?
And it's
Yeah.
hard for me to wrap around my head around it, Natalie, especially after 30 years of being in the field.
Right.
You
Right.
know,
Absolutely.
teaching not only nurses, but police officers, paramedics, physicians, uh,
Right.
you know, and yet having to say, no, I don't belong to a specialty. And
Hmm.
I left my emergency specialty behind. I chose between the two of them. And if you have time, I can also highlight something when again, always clinical. I mean, my heart is on clinical work.
Mhm.
When I knew beyond a doubt I was no longer an emergency nurse, but I had moved into the realm of being a forensic nurse. And it, of course, was a patient who came into emergency.
Mhm.
It was a very defining moment for me personally and professionally. And I know shortly after that, I went to my manager. I say my manager because we were a team, the three of us, the
Uh-huh.
medical director, the manager, and myself. Any major decisions for the department, we were together. And I said, I have to leave emergency. And she
Mm.
said, what? I said, I have to go with the nurse examiner program. And she said, when? And I said, now. She laughed at that. And okay. But it was so profound for me. And I've actually done a presentation at an emergency conference, and it is a child homicide. And
Mm.
it put me on a path that I could not turn back on.
Wow.
You know,
Yeah. Yeah. It is a calling. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think. Yeah. Yeah. And then I just wanted to talk to you about what do you see kind of in the future for forensic nursing? Like I've been a scene for about 18 years and I've seen a lot of
Oh, good for
change
you.
and I know it was pretty new at that time. Yeah, I've seen a lot of changes in forensic nursing over that time. And like just this week, I was listening to a online training from Dr. Smock. Yeah. Yes, yes.
Oh,
And people who
one
don't
of my
know who
favorite
he is,
people.
just briefly, he's one of the leading experts in forensic medicine. And he was discussing what he would like to see in the future for forensic nursing, that he would like to see a forensic nurse examiner in every emergency room in the US that could help care for victims of violence, document injury, just because we're trained specifically in doing that. And because there's a big difference between emergency nursing and forensic nursing. Like I've worked as an ER nurse for years, and we used to throw all the clothes on the floor and scrub everything down. Everything's got to be cleaned off, and we've got to get in there. And I mean, which is true in a trauma, but having a specialized forensic nurse right there at the bedside, and that's only what they're doing. I feel like that would be a really valuable resource. I just wanted to see kind of what your thoughts were for the future and kind of what you thought.
Well, Natalie, you're just reiterating a conversation I just had with the president of the National Emergency Nurses affiliation here in Canada,
Wow.
a couple of days ago. And because, as you say, as an emergency nurse, you know the good, bad, and the ugly of what we do.
Mhm. Right.
And back in the day when I first started teaching, I'd say, the worst thing for a forensic patient is an emergency nurse with a pair of scissors.
Yes.
And I wielded those scissors many, many, many times.
Yes.
I remember a police officer who came in injured, a leg injury, and of course in this reasonably small Canadian city, I said, "Sorry, but I got to cut your pants off." You know? And he's like, "Oh, Anyway, I met Dr. Smock in 1995
Oh,
in
wow.
Louisville, Kentucky, where he was
Yeah.
teaching at the university there.
Wow.
And actually, he got the brave forensic nurses, I think there was about 14 of us, to attend 3 forensic autopsies at the university.
Oh, wow.
I
Okay.
believe it was, yeah, I think it's the University of Lexington there. I'm not sure. It was in Lexington, Kentucky.
Mhm.
And again, I was hooked. I mean, because the significance of even a simple urinary catheter on an elderly person and the damage it does to the bladder was really, and then you can see why sepsis gets in, and and everybody,
Mhm.
oh, okay, no person died sepsis, but it was a healthcare tool, if you want, that actually was the beginning of this person's demise. Anyway, he is near and dear to my heart. We received awards together in 2010 from the International Association of Forensic Nurses. I've been trying desperately for getting funding to get him up here in Canada for probably 8 years.
Oh, wow.
It'll happen.
Mhm.
I think he's articulated it very well. In fact, Vice President Joe Biden was the one who first articulated a forensic nurse in every emergency
Mhm.
department in America. And
Mhm.
I'm very grateful for him, even though that it has not happened, um,
Mhm.
not in the US and not in Canada, but it is a goal.
Yeah.
And it's a reachable goal.
Mhm.
Maybe not in the next decade, because I
Mhm.
think he said that in the early 90s. But I see progress in if you put 30 years of my involvement, the first 10 years were keep your head above water.
Right.
The next 10 years is okay, maybe we can get some education. Maybe we can start getting some bursary funds. Maybe we can get more staff instead of all of us being casual and working 3 jobs.
Right.
Um, and now we're at this stage we're at, healthcare is starting to recognize this.
Yeah.
We are not nurse examiners in sexual violence anymore.
Mhm.
Our skills have been applied to other areas,
Mhm.
and and that's where my consulting work came in. uh,
Mhm.
Emergent, not just emergency, but hospital staff would say, "Hey, there's something funny about this patient. Can you come up and have a look?
Mhm.
Well, did you notice the bruise behind their ear, which is indicative of a head injury and a basal skull fracture?"
Mhm.
No.
Ah.
Really? I don't look behind ears. Well,
Right.
emergency nurses do, but not necessarily every other nurse.
Sure.
Um, so if I was looking at what would I like to see in the next 10 years, more recognition as a specialty here in Canada. That would be
Mhm.
the number one. Now, I know it's recognized in the United States and in Japan,
Oh, really? Oh, interesting.
but the rest of us are pretty much struggling. I believe Brazil is kind of almost on the verge, and I haven't kept up with what's happening in Brazil. So specialty status for the emerging forensic nurse role
Mhm.
in as many countries as possible. We do have an international organization already. That was 1992. And I know that, being the first non US president for IFN, uh, back then we talked about global involvement. I see more and more coming out of that now. Because, and I know this may offend some Americans, that IFN is still US centric. And the way I say that
Oh,
is because my US counterparts tell me that. Oh, because I say, well, do you know what? That doesn't work for this country or this country. Oh, yeah,
sure.
yeah. Oh, forgot. Um,
Right.
so the more global we become, the stronger we become.
Right.
Because again, World Health says this is our mandate as nurses.
Yeah.
The second would be in all countries, a central body that provides the administrative, the clinical, and the financial expertise to coordinate in whatever particular area that they are involved in, whether we're a state, a province, a country, so that we have uniformity to the best of our ability uh, in forensic nursing roles and procedures. Would be my next wish. And the last one would be for education that is transferable, you know, and to go along with that is the funding from whatever powers that be to recognize that forensic nurses are unique, who are dedicated to a patient population. Angela Amar, AMAR, and her other authors wrote an article called "The Forensic Patient Population," uh, talking about nurses, emergency nursing. And I have adopted that particular phrase because to me it is everything. There is a forensic patient population in every section of healthcare, and healthcare has to address that forensic patient population because it's different,
Right.
and it's unique. The forensic patient has different needs physically, emotionally, psychologically, and mentally, and criminally, if they so choose. If you ask the average nurse working in not the emergency nurse, because again, I'm very partial to my first love,
Right.
is what laws govern your practice? The majority will not know.
Right.
Whereas you ask a forensic nurse, well, this, and this. And you ask an emergency nurse, well, the first thing is consent. Second is what role do I play here? That I'm mandated to report gunshot wounds and stab wounds. I am mandated to report child abuse. States, yes, I have to report elder abuse as well. California is one. And so what do I need to report? What are my guidelines? How do I do my work differently? I don't ask all these quote unquote incriminating statements when I'm doing my patient history. I let it be an open ended conversation where the patient can answer yes or no to the things I absolutely need. And then he or she tells me what they want to tell me.
Right.
So, how long you known this guy? You met him at a bar? Or now it's, so you met online. Did you not know the hazards of this? You know? So emergency nurses don't do that for the norm anymore. But there is still racism, all kinds of ageism. We want to blame. You know why we want to do that? Because we are afraid for them. And we are
Right.
afraid when you have a 14-year-old girl standing in front of you saying what happened to her, and you have a 14-year-old at home, you just want to stop and hug her and say, why did you do that?
Right.
I'm sure you've had that feeling too.
Yes.
I remember one of my best nurses. She was on call for over a weekend, and she had 3 16-year-olds who were in precarious situations, and
Yeah.
violence and trauma happened to them. She came into my office Monday morning and she said, I've just had it with these 16-year-olds. And, and so I let her rant and rave and do whatever. And I said, you're upset. Yeah. I said, you're upset because you couldn't protect them.
Right.
And she stopped and she said, yeah, I can't protect them because it's already happened. And so I convinced her that her role was not to protect them. That was what parents and society were supposed to do. But her role was to prevent further harm to this young woman,
Yes.
to not be what the rest of the world was to her.
Right.
Like, I'm scared to death to tell my mom. Well, 90% of moms will dissolve in tears and hug their daughter. Not all. But the forensic nurse can be empathetic without being impartial, and not compromise anything about what's going to happen to this young woman or man after. And that's the role we have to play: is the objective, empathetic, knowledgeable, and skilled person
Mhm.
who sees all these things that other people don't see,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And if it means being the person to stand in front of her while she tells her mom and dad,
Mhm.
if that's what she wants, okay. If it
Yeah.
means you have to go outside the door and tell the police officer, sorry, she doesn't want to talk to you. Um,
Mhm.
I will, I've done everything that I am able to explain to her. If she changes her mind, please give
Right.
me your card, and I will
Mhm.
give it to her or her parents. And they, well, you know what? She's scared to death of you
Right.
at
Right.
this point. Sad,
Yeah.
but
Right.
and it's even at 16, that's their choice.
Absolutely. I think it's hard to explain that to people that, you know, it is ultimately the patient's choice and they have to choose what's best for them. And it doesn't matter what we, what other people think or believe, it's really up to the patient to
Right, and of
decide.
course, there's extenuating circumstances, which we all know. The ability to give consent. And we talked recently about what do we do with individuals who don't want to report to law enforcement, but yet want to know if they were drugged.
Right.
And that's not really a forensic role. That's a
Hmm.
medical.
Hmm.
And the reality is, most of the time, you're never going to know anyway.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so make your decision with the amount of information you have about what's happened.
Mhm.
This is what, if you report to law enforcement, this is what will happen. If you don't, this is what will happen. These are the caveats. For example, here in Canada, the majority of programs save evidence for a year.
Mhm.
Some change their mind. Some only save it for 3 months, depending on storage facilities.
Mhm.
But giving their options, and also I've always felt that you're asking an individual, whether they're young, old, or whatever, to make a life altering decision at the worst possible time in their life.
Right. Right.
And often I would say, and I've done, I think probably if I ballparked it, from the cases that I call my own are in the
Mhm.
neighborhood of 600, because I was also doing coordinator world, but the cases that
Mhm.
I've been involved in are literally thousands.
Oh, God.
Because you buddy for shift and you train nurses,
Right.
and but the majority would say, well, your explanations really help me, or I don't understand this. But if you can't, at the end of the day, which it could be 45 minutes into a interview, um,
Mhm.
if you can't make a decision, then don't,
Right.
because you will regret a decision you made under any kind of duress from your
Yes.
mom, your dad, your boyfriend,
Yes.
your husband, even law enforcement, because law
Mhm.
enforcement are to protect the public.
Mhm.
Nurses are to advocate for our patients.
Right. Right.
So, uh, and surprisingly, the ones that go out the door, many of them come back because you've allowed them
Mhm.
that power back.
Right.
Yeah. And my staff used to be very upset with me because I'd say, well, I think she's going to come back. I gave her my card. So Triage knows to call me when she comes, because you don't want them to start over. And
Right.
my husband would say, they're going to call at 2 in the morning. And I go, oh, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
those are,
They're pretty powerful.
yeah, those
Yeah.
are the
Pretty
three
powerful
things
call.
that I see for
Mhm.
sure, globally in
Yeah.
forensic nursing. And I think once we get into more established into healthcare education,
Mhm.
that it will, exponentially, things are, it may well be the profession of the immediate future.
Mhm. Wow. That would really be exceptional. Yeah.
It would be
Wow.
lovely
Yeah.
because of the impact it can make on healthcare. You
Right.
know,
Wow. And what would you say to nurses out there who are interested in the field of forensics? How would they, do you say, steer them?
well, the first thing I would say is, if you're in Canada, join our student group in the Canadian Forensic Nurses Association, and if you're in America, do the same for the International Association of Forensic Nurses, because they welcome students.
Mhm.
It's part of our strategic plan to assist students in any way we can.
Yeah.
Also, too, is to look at, depending on your funding
Mhm.
and your time. If you are, already in a basic nursing education, I can pretty much guarantee that you have not received anything to do with the knowledge of forensic nursing, let alone what to do in sexual violence, child abuse. The medical parts will be there, but the implications of whatever has happened, both criminally and post in healthcare, are probably not addressed. Um, so you could ask your instructors to contact a forensic nurse and have them come in and talk to your class,
Yeah.
because that's usually what leads interest. The
Yeah.
one-on-one contact with someone who actually does the work and can explain the good, bad, and the ugly to you.
Yeah.
There's many, many, many sources of online education where you can take. You have to be a little bit careful because some of them are out there just to take your money. But there's a lot of free education that you can reach out in your own community. For example, if you happen to know there's a nurse examiner program, call the coordinator and say, "Hey, could somebody come and talk to my class? If your instructor's not interested, or can I come and talk to you about it, or do an interview like this?" A lot of students like to do interviews, and most forensic nurses will just love to talk about what they do.
Yes.
uh, Once you're completed your basic nursing education, look to take something like an introductory course, because an introduction to forensic health sciences or forensic nursing, and those are available too. And because I think people will look at the focus of sexual violence and they won't understand that the subspecialties
Right.
are there. They might come in saying, "Oh, I want to be a nurse examiner," and saying, "Oh, no, I really want to be a death investigator."
Yeah.
Or, "Gee, I didn't know that geriatrics was important." And elder abuse and all the different aspects of elder maltreatment. So having a course that highlights the different components to the subspecialties, and and getting some basic principles. I know the biggest change I found with the introduction courses was, oh my, I document so differently now, because as much as we teach documentation and the nursing basic education, we still don't do enough. You know yourself, okay? Probably when you were, your first job, you documented a bruise on the left arm. As a forensic nurse, you look at that bruise, you tell me the color of it, the size of it, the dimensions of it, and then you look for all the other ones.
Right.
So the instructors that I've been able to mentor, they say, we use the term forensic lens. Same patient as you have in medicine or surgery, but the forensic nurse comes in and he or she puts on that forensic lens and says, okay, what's out of the ordinary? And this is not anything to do with medical surgical nursing or ICU nursing. It's it's like we were taught to cut clothes off.
Right.
It takes changes to make us say, okay, I can take these off and I can put a white sheet on the floor in my trauma room and I can drop the pants there. And one of the biggest things about clothing, which I consider the most important forensic evidence in the emergency department, is that you have no knowledge about what that blood on a piece of clothing means.
Right.
That's up to a forensic scientist to determine. And if we screw it up, they do not have the ability to use the best evidence possible.
Right.
Dr. Smog talks about blood spatter a lot, and and I can't tell you how many times I go into an ER and see, oh boy, everything all jumbled up,
Yeah.
But it takes practice, and it takes it doesn't actually take much more time. It just means that you have to recognize this might be important, and I don't know why, but I'm going to save it anyway.
Right. Right.
And then it'll come back to you like it did to me. One single hair.
Wow.
What if he had never
Yeah.
presented to police and turned himself in? If he did another crime, I don't know how much DNA they would have been able to get off that. But
Mhm.
if it was a similar type crime and he left further evidence, that would be quite different.
Mhm.
And that's one of the things people have to remember about particular sexual violence. The kids that go examined
Mhm.
mean that particular person is still going out there doing it again. And
Right.
I think there was a Dateline special on that, and where they actually paid to have a number of kits processed, and in that was a serial killer.
Oh, right.
It was several years
Yes.
ago. I still have the VHS tapes on it. Bad.
Okay, well, that's so great. Thank you so much